I'm live at last. Is this right? Good. Right, okay, we're working, we're in business. Got a few people on. Perfect. 13 minutes later than advertised, because I was having some technical difficulties. But maybe the first bit of information to give you all is this YouTube live thing. It's going to be happening at 8:30 from now on, because that was a bit of a rush to get back here in time. So I'll just give people, you can see what question I'm going to look at. If you've already just got in and just logged on, I would write this question down. If you can read it, hopefully you can, it's back to front of me. In the period 1500 to 1700, the main aim of changes to punishments was retribution. How far do you agree? You may use bloody code transportation. So yeah, I'll just give you a minute to sort yourself out. I'm trying to work out how I can see me on live stream on here, so I can see whether it's working or not, and then we'll delve straight in. There we go. Alright, perfect. So now I can type on there. So the Mac wasn't working, the camera wouldn't work on the Mac for some reason. In the period 1500 to 1700, the main aim of changes to punishments was retribution. How far do you agree? Right, so now you don't have to worry, because the question should have pinged up in live chat, and if somebody can give me some idea that you can actually hear me, that would be fantastic. Say, yeah, we can hear you loud and clear. If indeed you can. Or don't. Ah, perfect. Right then, let's delve in. So first of all, you may or may not be in my class. Doesn't matter. I just want to make sure that you're aware of my absolutely key thing that I need you to know, of how to do well in any of these exams. Never mind history, biology, maths, whatever it is. And my experience tells me that this bit between January and Easter is the bit where you get your grade. The bit after Easter, everybody's revising. Everybody's working hard. So if you want to get ahead of the game while logging on now and listening to this is going to be really useful. So hopefully you've had a little think about that question and whether you feel like you'll be able to answer it already. I've made a few notes. However, the big problem there is I made the notes on my iPad, and that's what I'm filming from. So I'm going to perhaps be a little bit more stuttering than I would like. Now, first thing with the question, if you're an A-star student or grade 9, 8, 7 student, as many of you will be having logged on here, you look at this question and think, how are you going to stand out? Well, I think the key thing that will trip people, there's two things. First of all, retribution. That's going to be a key thing. What does retribution actually mean? And, there's a big chance that sort of word might crop up in your exams. Well, retribution is a bit, if you only think of it as getting your own back. If you think the punishment should fit the crime, you're thinking you've got to make the punishment equal the crime so that they've got what they deserve. That's kind of it. Retribution, they've got what they deserved. But the one that people, I think, people would do all right, but not necessarily the top, if they'd not focused on this, changes. Now, the examiners say focusing on the question is absolutely crucial. So, this is why. And then, you've got this whole period of 200 years. You've got to try to show some awareness of what was going on across those 200 years. And so, because it is in the question, retribution, it would be my recommendation, of course, to start off with your line of reasoning. Mine would be, in the period 1500 to 1700, the main aim of changes to punishments was not retribution, but it was to be a deterrent. Full stop, that's my line of reasoning. As soon as the examiner picks up my piece of paper, they read it, they go, I know what this person thinks straight away, and that's very, very important. I will go on to explain why. But in my first paragraph, I would do retribution, because that's mentioned in the question. And I can refer back to retribution in other paragraphs. That would mean I'm really focusing on the question. So I'm going to focus on this, I'm going to focus on this, and I'm going to focus on this. So a top tip is do this. I'm your teacher. I guarantee you, I swear, if I was sat in the exam, I would underline the keywords in the question, just to make sure I was going right in the right direction straight away. Because if you've done loads of revising and you're really clever, but you go off down the wrong path, you're going to stitch yourself up, aren't you? So, retribution, getting your own back. Then the criminals getting what they deserved. I think this is the weakest in terms of reasons for punishments at the time. It's a difficult one to argue, because you could almost say every punishment is giving the criminals what they deserve. What I would pick out is in the 1500s, there was very little in terms of punishment that was to do with retribution. There was bigger motivations for the punishments of the 1500s. However, one that did occur to me was prison. And that might surprise you, because prison, of course, was something which was more in use in the industrial period. In the medieval period, prison was only somewhere to keep criminals before they went on trial. But in the early modern period, prison was somewhere you put prisoners before they went on trial, and it was also somewhere you put people who were in debt. And so the idea is you're sort of punishing them for not paying off their debt, debtors' prisons. And it's retribution, it's get your own back. Until you can pay, you're staying in here. And that's not to reform. There might be an element of to deter, but that is the case with most punishments. And it's not to remove the criminal from society, because they're not a danger to society. And so, after a bit of thought, it made me think, the debtors' prisons in the early modern period, they're probably a form of retribution, because it's the person who's in debt getting a punishment for being in debt, and seemingly what they deserve. So I've tried the 1500s, but the easier one for me was the 1600s, the 17th century, for two things. First of all, what happened in 1605? You sat there, hopefully you're thinking, the gunpowder plot happened in 1605. Right, now those people, they were hung, drawn and quartered. Hanged from the neck, they were drawn through the streets, people chucking things at them, hanged from the neck till they were nearly dead, chopped down, cut down here, and then their insides were pulled out and burnt in front of them. Again, Ghost, not doing requests tonight unless it's particularly to do with the exam question. And these are just quick 20-minute bursts. I don't want to overload people. 20 minutes bursts on an exam question. The nights before the actual exams, I'll do longer podcasts where you can ask whatever you want. Or maybe I'll do a few when they run up to the exams. So, retribution, 1500s. Debtors' prisons, 1605, the gunpowder plotters dared to try to blow all the most important people in the country up, and they got horrific punishment. That seems to suggest that they were getting retribution for a terrible, terrible crime they were trying to commit. And also there's a notable individual that you could mention, and that is King Charles I. Now, he was the king. He's not in the textbooks. This is bonus. This is why you log on to these things. And this sort of thing which would stand out to the examiner. They go, that's something I've not read before. So King Charles I, linking to the Civil War, he lost the Civil War in the 1640s. Mostly the Civil War was fought. And when he'd lost the Civil War, Oliver Cromwell and Parliament had him beheaded. Now, they didn't behead the king to remove him from society because he was going around committing crimes all the time. They didn't behead the king to deter other kings because there weren't any at the time to try to deter, in England anyway. So the main reason why they must have given him that punishment is because of his crime of, causing the Civil War according to Parliament, and that's retribution. But those, that you don't need loads. There's three things I've talked about there in terms of retribution: prison, like debtors in prison, people who owe money. King Charles I, just talked about now, got his head chopped off, accused of causing the Civil War, and of course the gunpowder plotters. But for me, the biggest reason for aims of punishment, which I'm going to write on my envelope, high tech, is this one, to deter. And it's well worth learning about the reasons for punishments. We've had it in mock exams before, certainly you've been in my class, and we've done practice questions on it. I assume you will have done it whatever class you're in, so that tells us they might ask you about reasons for punishments in different time frames. Deter is a key one. Medieval, early medieval, and even into the industrial, for a chunk of the time anyway, punishments had to be cheap because the country wasn't collecting enough tax. It wasn't wealthy enough to support any expensive punishments, and it had to be quick. And so a lot of punishments in this period were there to deter. What examples can I give? Well, they would stick people in the stocks, of course. That, again, they did that with people who owed money or people who tried to be dishonest when they were selling things or cheated at cards. They get them in the village, stick them in the stocks, you can chuck things at them. What else? Now, there's elements, and I would be talking about this, although I've talked about the gunpowder plotters being an example of a punishment of retribution. Actually, it was also, in terms of a treason punishment, so you will get hung, drawn and quartered, horrible death, if you committed treason, which is what the gunpowder plotters did. Why would you give them such a horrible punishment? To try to deter other people who would go, I don't fancy committing treason against the king, if that's what happens to you. There's so many, almost every punishment you could think of at this time, which is my main argument, by the way. You could look at it and you could go, they've done that because it would make other people look and go, won't fancy that punishment, and that would put me off from crime. And it was a big thing at the time because, of course, they didn't have a police force. Law enforcement was done by everybody, and unless you actually physically caught somebody committing a crime, it was very difficult to work out who'd done it. There weren't any detectives. So their main way of trying to stop crime was to make the punishment so bad that people wouldn't risk committing crime in the first place. I would mention the gunpowder plotters. I've mentioned the people being stuck in the stocks. What else could I mention? Of course, and it will crop up again in my next paragraph. In the late 1600s, I believe around 1685, but you'll have to check the Quizlet for that. It's definitely on there. In fact, I'll check on here. The bloody code began. It was at the end of the 1600s anyway. If I'm in my exam, by the way, I'm your teacher. I haven't remembered that date. I'm right here in front of you. You've seen it. That might happen to you. You sat in the exam, you're thinking, I think it's 1685, which is when I think the bloody code began, but I'm not 100%. So in the exam, I would write, at the very end of the 17th century, of course. Then I've got around the problem. So at the very end of the 17th century, they introduced the bloody code. They increased the number of crimes for which you could get the death penalty. I know that was 50 in the late 1600s. It rose to over 200 in the industrial period, but of course the exam question doesn't care about that. So you may as well not write about it. Just write about there were 50 crimes by the end of the 17th century for which you could get the death penalty. Why did they do that? They wanted to make the punishment so bad, even for small crimes, that people wouldn't want to commit the crime in the first place. Now, I'm checking by searching on my Kindle book, bloody code. There we go. 1688, so I was wrong. I said 1685, so it would have been a good job in the exam that said the end of the 17th century. So that's deter, and you could almost pick any punishment, really. They did whipping of people. They carted them through the town. Humiliation was a big part of this. And then the final category that would do would be to remove the criminal from society. So what specifically changes came in to remove people from society? Well, at the end of the period, you've got to here, bloody code and transportation. You get the criminals, you kill them, they've gone. They're not a problem to society anymore. You get the criminals, you ship them off to America, they're done. They're not a problem to society anymore, they've gone. And of course, executions happen throughout this period. if you even could go back to the English Reformation and the Tudor period after Henry VIII had reformed the church, and of course there was that religious turbulence where Protestants might get executed by Bloody Mary, and then Catholics might have been executed under any of the other monarchs who were all Protestant. And so there's another example. You get them, they're doing a disservice to the country. It might affect you as the leader when you die and are judged in the afterlife if you've let them do this sort of worshipping. So you remove them from society, you sort the problem out, you tell them you must change your ways or you're executed. Recant, if you remember the word. So yeah, removing from society. Now remember I've said, I'm only going to talk for another 4 minutes, about changes is going to be key. So in my conclusion, and this is my conclusion, hopefully you'll get this. So, in conclusion, in the period 1500 to 1700, the main aim of changes to punishment was to deter. Almost every example of a punishment that was introduced at the time, you could find some example, or you could find some reason to say this is a deterrent, because the punishments were largely very, very unpleasant. And even one of the least unpleasant ones, houses of correction, they got vagabonds, they stuck them in a place which is a bit like prison is now perhaps, but a lot worse. They'd make them do terribly hard work with the idea that they'd change as a person. They'd see the value of hard work when they came out. Even that, you would be there just breaking rocks all day. If you were a vagabond, you go, I won't fancy being stuck in a house of correction. That is deterrent, to make people not want to do it. So all of these forms, and houses of correction, late 1500s, transportation, late 1600s again, like 1660s I believe with transportation, yep. Bloody Code we've talked about, 1688, which I know I should probably remember a little bit more now, 50 crimes introduced, all of these changes brought in, the changes that were created to try to deter people more than anything else. So that would be, oops, I'm off. That would be my number one reason as to why punishments happened at all, but also why changes were brought in at the time. And so last bit, hopefully you've seen, I've gone across the period, not just picked stuff at the end, and I think the examiner might have tried to trick you by only mentioning these two that you can use. I've talked about changes that were brought in, things that were brought in terms of punishment, and certainly tackled retribution. Retribution was important, but it was more important that punishments were cheap and quick. And for that reason, and also law enforcement had to be cheap and quick. And also this is why the main aim of any changes to punishment was to deter and not to get retribution. And you could see as well the Bloody Code at the end of the period, to execute somebody for stealing a loaf of bread, for example, that the punishment doesn't commit the crime. That's not getting your own back on them. That's making the crime so bad that other people don't want to commit the crime at all. So there you go. There's a little bit in the period 1500 to 1700. The main aim of changes to punishments was retribution. Thank you for logging on. Thank you for people who look later on. You can ask questions. It's a bit, you can process this. Maybe ask questions next time. I will take requests if there's something specific that you would like me to answer, go over an exam question on. You can put it on here. And lastly, my big recommendation, learn the Epic Quizlets. I'm going to put a link to the Epic Quizlets just on here, in case you're not in my class or at all and I haven't shown you them. You probably will have come across them if you're in all the classes just about now. I would join this class, get yourself on, learn those Quizlets, learn, keep doing them, then you've got some key knowledge guaranteed in your head, so things aren't so overwhelming before. And I can see from my live I'm on 19 minutes, 17 seconds. Everyone's a winner. See you at school tomorrow. Don't forget to be, if you're in my class, don't forget to be learning your subject knowledge. Civil Rights Quizlet, I believe, for your subject knowledge test tomorrow. Thanks very much. Thanks for the thanks. See you later. Now how do I log off this thing?